Welcome, everybody. My name is Megan Wolf, and I'm the Health Policy Director at Beyond Plastics. We are so glad to have you join us tonight. As most of you know, Beyond Plastics seeks to end plastic pollution through education, advocacy, and institutional change. We've been watching the conversation about the plastic crisis evolve over the past few years. And we note that as we learn more about the presence of microplastics in the environment, the food web, and even our bodies, one of the main new directions of interest and discussion is the impact of plastic on human health. So that's what we're here to talk about tonight. I want to introduce our two main interlocutors, which are Judith Enck and Philip Landrigan. Most of you are familiar with Judith. She's the president and founder of Beyond Plastics, which she launched in 2019. Judith has held top influential positions in state and federal government. Through the Obama administration, she served as the administrator for Region 2 of the EPA. Previously, Judith served as Deputy Secretary for the Environment in New York Governor's Office and Policy Advisor to the New York State Attorney General. She was Senior Environmental Associate with NYPIRG, which was the New York Public Interest Research Group, and she served as the Executive Director for Environmental Advocates of New York and the Nonprofit Resource Center, and is a past president of the Hudson River Sloop Club in Clearwater. Judith appears on a weekly public affairs radio show on a local NPR affiliate, which is the Roundtable on WAMC in Albany, New York. So in short, you've seen her in a lot of places. We're always glad to have her with us. And we're joined today also by Philip Landrigan. Philip Landrigan is a pediatrician and epidemiologist. He directs the Program for Global Public Health and the Common Good and the Global Observatory on Planetary Health at Boston College. From 1985 to 2018, he was a member of the faculty of the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where he served as chairman of the Department of Preventive Medicine, professor of pediatrics, and the dean of global health. Dr. Landrigan is one of the most well-regarded healthcare voices in the climate fight, largely because of his incredibly successful work documenting the impacts of environmental toxicants and putting the data in front of policymakers where it can be acted upon. For example, in the 1970s, his studies of lead at the CDC demonstrated that low-level lead exposure reduces children's IQ, a finding that contributed to the EPA's 1975 decision to remove lead paint from gasoline. Sorry, lead from paint and gasoline. That action, or those actions, reduced blood lead levels by 95% and increased the IQ of all American children born since 1980. In the 1990s, Dr. Landrigan's documentation of children's exquisite sensitivity to pesticides contributed to the enactment of the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996, which is the only federal environmental law in the United States that contains explicit provisions to protect children's health. In that same decade, he helped to establish the EPA's Office of Children's Health Protection. Jumping forward into the 2020s, he led the Minderoo-Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health, which is how I've come to know him. Dr. Landrigan has a nose for toxins, and his attention to plastics has helped to pivot the topic from a concern about litter to a more pervasive concern about human health. But I don't need to say much more. Dr. Landrigan is one of the clearest and most knowledgeable presenters on the health impacts of plastic, and having him here in conversation with Judith Enck is truly a pleasure. So thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much, Megan. I'm going to be mercifully short in my comments because I want you all to hear the inspired words of Dr. Phil Landrigan. You probably can see my really messy bookshelf behind me. I need to find 5 minutes to clean it, but that bookshelf is filled with Phil Landrigan reports. My favorite being pesticides in the diets of infants and children. Phil, I should have you sign it one day. Dr. Landrigan is going to provide some really compelling information tonight, and it's my great hope that it doesn't paralyze you, but that it inspires you to political action. And I'm going to come back at the end and talk about two very specific political action steps you can take in the short term. But as you listen to this presentation, I want to invite you to think about how you can work in your own community to reduce the production, use, and disposal of plastics. This is not an academic conversation. This is an all hands on deck moment. I'm reminded of the wonderful quote from Alice Waters, activism is the rent we pay for living on this planet. And we need you. We need you all in the arena. We want you to be informed. We want you to be timely. You're going to get good information tonight, and put on your public policy thinking cap and how we can work together to address this problem before it gets even worse. So it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Phil Landrigan.
Thank you, Judith. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to all of you who are watching this evening. My topic tonight is plastics and your health, which is going to show in a minute here. Let's start with this horrifying picture. I think this is the sort of picture that first caught the world's attention about plastics. And this goes back 5 or 10 years. There are 6 billion tons of plastic waste polluting the planet at this time. A lot of it ends up in the ocean. Some of it does bad things to marine mammals like this, or even very large marine mammals like this whale who is beached and died on having filled his gastrointestinal tract with plastic waste. There's also plastic on beaches, especially in low-income and middle-income countries where children earn $1 a day or less picking out of the plastic waste what can be salvaged, and it ends up in cities. Again, typically in low-income countries. This is in Dhaka, Bangladesh. But we now know that plastics are not just in the third world. They're here with us, and they're causing harm to us. And about 2 years ago, a group of us, supported by the Minderoo Foundation and by the Scientific Center of Monaco, formed the Minderoo Monaco Commission on Plastics and Health. And the goal was to determine what are the hazards to human health that result from plastic. And we hypothesized that those hazards extended far beyond environmental pollution, far beyond beach litter. And we decided to approach the topic by looking at plastics harms across the whole life cycle of plastic, from cradle to grave. And I'll walk you through that concept of the plastic life cycle in just a second. And we had people on this commission from many disciplines. We had medical doctors, we had public health specialists, we had environmental scientists, oceanographers, economists, and even lawyers to look at the health impacts, the environmental impacts, the economic, and the social justice impacts of plastic. And here's the paper that we published. It came out a year ago in March of 2023 in a medical journal called Annals of Global Health. That DOI, which is down at the bottom, is a document identification number. If you click on that number, you can get the full report, all 150 pages of it. It's probably more than you want to read in one sitting, but you can use it as a reference. And I've listed here the names of all of our many distinguished authors. So let's start with a quick review of the chemistry of plastic. All plastic, no matter what type, fundamentally has two main components. Firstly, it has polymer. These long chains here represent polymer. And a polymer is defined as a very large molecule comprised of repeating carbon atoms with various other atoms like these green things sticking out from the side. But the backbone of all plastic is carbon, specifically fossil carbon, which comes from coal, comes from gas, comes from oil. The second component of plastic are all these smaller molecules that are stuck in to the polymer skeleton, into the matrix. And those are chemicals that give plastic color, or make it flexible, or make it water resistant, or make it fire resistant, convey various properties. And those chemicals are not tightly bound. And we'll talk about what that means for human health in a moment. So the polymer backbone, and then about 16,000 chemicals. And that's probably a low count of the true number because nobody keeps good records on this and nobody's required to. But we know that these chemicals include plasticizers, antioxidants, processing aids. And we know that many of them are toxic. We know that these chemicals include carcinogens that can cause cancer. They include neurotoxicants that can damage the brain and nervous system. They include endocrine disruptors that can get into the bloodstream and hijack the signaling system of the human body called the endocrine system that's driven by the glands, the thyroid, the adrenals, the ovaries, the testes, all the hormone secreting organs in the human body that collectively comprise the endocrine system, play a vital role in coordinating the functioning of the human body and in guiding early human development during pregnancy and childhood. And a lot of these chemicals can interfere with the endocrine system. They're called endocrine disruptors. And there's even more chemicals that represented by this large gray area here on the left that have never ever been tested. Roughly half of the chemicals in plastic have simply never been tested for their toxicity. They're chemicals that are put in there. People are exposed to them, we're exposed to them, and we don't have a clue what they might do to us. Very, very unsafe. So those 16,000 chemicals leach out of plastic. Some of them have been very carefully studied. Most of them have not been well studied, and a bunch of them have never been studied at all. We know that they get into the environment. You can see them on beaches. You can see them in the tissues of fish and whales. And they get into us. In the last 3, 4, 5 years, there have been a series of studies looking at microplastic particles in the human body, and they've been found in many organs. And the big question then arises, okay, so what does it do to our health? And let's come to that in a minute. These microplastics, I should say, back up a moment, how do they arise? They arise in landfills into the ocean. And over time, the plastic breaks down. It doesn't go away. The stuff's immortal, but it breaks down into smaller and smaller particles, which are microplastics or below 1 micron in diameter. They're known as nanoplastics. And nanoplastics are particularly dangerous because they can actually penetrate into the cells of the human body. And these micro and nanoplastic particles carry in them all those 16,000 chemicals that are in plastic. And then when the particles get into your stomach, into your liver, into your heart, into your brain, they can leach those toxic chemicals out of the particle into the tissue. And that's when harm arises. So what's driving this? Why is plastic such a big problem? And the driver is exponential, reckless increases in plastic production. So this graph is looking at the time span from 1950 all the way out to 2050. It's a century. Here we are here. It's not the bar is a year or two behind reality, but we're approximately here. And there's several interesting things you can take out of this graph. The first is that plastic production really didn't get going until the 1950s, right after World War II. And it was slow at first. Plastic was considered a miracle material. It was expensive. It was used very carefully. And it didn't really begin to increase until about the year 2000. Here's the year 2000. But you can see that more than half of all the plastic that's ever been made, more than half of the plastic in this red triangle has been made since the year 2000. It's really going up. And then it's on track to double by 2040 and triple by 2060. Right now, about 8 billion tons of plastic have been produced. 6 billion of those 8 pollute the Earth's environment because it doesn't go away, and the balance is still in use. And another important fact is that close to 40% of current production is single-use plastic, plastic bottles, plastic bags, useless plastic cutlery that's made to be used once and thrown away. And this is a key point that Judith wants everybody to remember, is that less than 10% of plastic is recycled. It's not because people don't care. I see students on our campus at Boston College very conscientiously putting their plastic bottles in the proper bins. I see kids separating stuff in the dining room, putting the plastic in one place and the paper. It's not that people don't care. The problem is with the plastic itself. There are many different types of plastic: polystyrene, polyvinyl chloride, polyurethane, polyethylene, and so on. It turns out that they cannot be commingled. They can't be mixed together in the recycling stream. They just don't go together. And secondly, because plastic contains so many toxic chemicals, the stuff that comes out the other end from a recycling facility is loaded with those toxins, and it's useless for most applications. So for those reasons, less than 10% of plastic is recycled, meaning that 90% is tossed away. It either goes into landfills, or it goes into the ocean, or it gets put on ships and carried from high-income countries like ours to low-income countries, where it ends up on the beaches and results in that horrible picture I showed you at the beginning here. At the same time as plastic production is going up, production of the synthetic chemicals that goes into plastic is going up. No surprise, because the same companies make them, and both the plastics themselves and the great majority of these chemicals come from fossil carbon, from coal, from oil, from gas. So in the Mindoro-Monaco Commission, we looked at the plastic life cycle, and we divided that life cycle into 3 categories: production, use, and disposal. And production includes feedstock extraction, which means fracking to get gas, oil drilling to get oil, and mining to get coal. And it includes transportation, carrying those products to the factory, and then the actual manufacture. Use is use, when we use plastics every day in our lives. Recycling and disposal include landfilling, burning, shipment overseas. And then finally, something that often gets overlooked when people talk about plastic is the plastic has a very large carbon footprint. Plastic production is hugely energy intensive, and then the plastic itself consumes a great deal of carbon. And it turns out that plastic production produces almost 4% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than the annual greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by Brazil. Let's show you a few pictures of the steps along the plastic life cycle. So here's a fracking well in North Dakota. And you can see this is a massive industrial operation. And in North Dakota, there are hundreds of these things spread out across the prairie. What was once pristine grass country is now just covered with these industrial devices that suck the gas out of the ground. They require enormous quantities of water to operate. Water gets pushed down into the ground to displace the gas and force the gas up. And what that means in this arid country is that hundreds, thousands of these tanker trucks full of water and other chemicals have to visit the fracking site day and night, night and day. Then we have transportation. Once the gas is taken out of the ground, it has to be moved through pipelines, on ships, on rail, and sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes things go horribly wrong, and this is what happened in February of 2023 in East Palestine, Ohio, when a tanker train carrying plastics, chemicals, vinyl chloride monomer, overturned, and there was subsequently a fire. The whole town had to be evacuated. Then plastic manufacture. This is a picture of a plastic manufacturing plant in New Jersey, horribly polluting. And 2 groups of people are particularly at risk here. Firstly, the workers inside the plant who are making the plastic, and secondly, the people who live in the fence line communities just outside the plant. Then here we have plastic use, little kids playing with plastic, and of course, when they play with plastic, they chew it. The dust from the plastic gets on their fingers. They swallow what they chew, they swallow the dust, and any of those chemicals that are in the plastic get into the kids. And kids typically have more exposure, pound for pound, than we adults, just because of the way they play and behave. When the chemicals in plastic get into our bodies, they can produce a whole range of harms. Because they're neurotoxics, because they can cause cancer, because they can disrupt endocrine function, because they can disrupt the immune system. Plastics have a whole range of negative effects. So starting with infancy, they can increase miscarriage, they can increase premature birth and low birth weight babies, they can increase the frequency of birth defects of the reproductive organs. In children, plastic chemicals like phthalates and bisphenol A have been shown to reduce IQ, to impair fine motor development. The endocrine disruptors in plastics can disrupt thyroid function. They can result in hypertension and obesity. They can alter the timing of puberty, which is not a good thing. And then in adults, in both males and females, they have a whole range of hazardous effects, including cancer, endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. As a pediatrician, I particularly want to emphasize the vulnerability of infants in the womb and young children to plastics chemicals. And basically any toxic chemical from plastic or from any other product that gets into the body of a pregnant woman is almost certainly going to go through to her baby. A long time ago, it was taught that the placenta, the tissue that surrounds the baby in the womb, was a shield, a protective shield that would protect the baby against anything bad in the outside world. And it does function to protect infants against trauma. For example, if the mother falls, the placenta provides a cushion. But it is no barrier at all to these chemicals. These small molecules from plastic can go right through the placenta and go right into the baby and then concentrate in the rapidly growing organs of the baby, the heart, the brain, the lungs. And in the baby, they can cause brain damage, they can cause birth defects, they can change the baby's cells and not necessarily cause cancer that is obvious at birth, but they can increase risk for testicular cancer 15 years later when the baby boy becomes a teenager, that kind of thing. The brain damage caused by plastics can produce autism, attention deficit disorder, IQ loss. All of that impedes children's ability to learn, to do well in school, to succeed in life. And we've learned, starting way back 50 years ago with lead, there are simply no safe exposure thresholds. And in early human development, even the lowest imaginable doses of these toxic chemicals can damage the child in the mother's womb, because early human development is so exquisitely, so terribly vulnerable, it's easily disrupted. And once the damage is done, once cells have been either killed or altered by toxic chemicals, the damage lasts lifelong. Loving parents and good teachers can help children to develop workarounds to cope with their disability, but the disability is there, it doesn't go away. Just recently, it's come to the attention of the medical world that microplastic particles can cause heart disease. Remember, I mentioned a few minutes ago that microplastics have been detected in multiple tissues in the human body, including the heart. But just last month, or 2 months ago now, in March of this year, was a major article published in the New England Journal of Medicine looking at the relationship between microplastics and arteriosclerosis. So this is a paper that was done by a group of cardiologists in Italy. They had 312 patients, and those patients underwent a procedure called carotid endarterectomy. So what carotid endarterectomy is a procedure to clean out the carotid arteries, the big arteries in the neck, one on the left, one on the right, the big arteries that carry the blood from the heart up to the brain. They're the main blood supply to the brain. And if arteriosclerosis builds up in these carotid arteries, like in this picture here, it can block the flow, can increase the risk of stroke, it can increase the risk of what's called TIAs, transient ischemic attacks. And cardiologists have learned that they've developed procedures to get rid of this stuff. What they do is they slide a catheter into the blood vessels, either at the elbow or the groin, run it up through the vessels into the carotid artery, and then like a little roto-rooter, it goes around inside the vessel and scrapes that stuff out and restores full blood flow to the brain. So what these physicians in Italy did was they took that material which they had pulled out of the carotid arteries and they analyzed it for microplastics under the microscope. And they found that almost 60% of the patients had microplastics in this tissue, which is called plaque. It's this material, if I can find the pointer here. Oh yeah, that's called plaque. And these patients with plaque had a 450% increase of a heart attack, a stroke, or death over the next 3 years compared to the 40% of people that did not have microplastics. Now, it's only one study, therefore it does not prove cause and effect. But this is a very striking finding. It's very seldom in medicine that you see an increase in risk of this great magnitude. You just don't see that stuff. You see it with smoking and lung cancer. You see it with asbestos and lung cancer, but you don't get these big risks very frequently in medicine. So this is a striking finding. It's got to be replicated. Other people around the world are working now to see if they can validate it. But in the meantime, it's something that it's a huge orange flag. We have to take it very seriously. Now, changing gears, I mentioned that we had economists on our team, and Professor Maureen Cropper at the University of Maryland led this analysis. She looked at the costs of plastic under two categories: production and the damages to health caused by the chemicals in plastic. So looking at production, she looked at the costs of injuries and accidents to fracking workers. She looked at the air pollution released by fracking. She looked at the impacts of the greenhouse gases that are released in plastic production. And she looked at these impacts on a global basis for the whole world, and it's almost 600 billion per year. And then turning to the health impacts of the plastics chemicals, she looked at the healthcare costs and the lost productivity that results when people are taken out of the workforce by illness or by premature death. And she found that these costs were also quite massive and amounted to about $700 billion per year. And that's just in one country, just one country. We didn't have data at that time from other countries. So just putting these two numbers together, they add together, comes out to 1.25, $1.3 billion. It's important to understand that those costs are not borne by the plastic industry. No, instead, they are externalized, which is to say they're dumped on us. We pay out of pocket, we pay through our taxes, governments has to pay, but the fossil fuel industry just offloads those costs and lets the rest of us worry about them. There's huge social and environmental injustice at every stage of the plastic life cycle, in production, in use, in disposal. I'm not going to walk you through this whole thing, but suffice it to say that plastics harms at every stage of the cycle fall disproportionately upon the poor, the vulnerable, fence line communities, workers, minority people. Fracking wells and oil wells are almost always located in low-income neighborhoods. Pipelines run through poor towns. They don't go through wealthy suburbs. In plastic use, women and children, all of us who eat food, are exposed to plastics in the food, plastic chemicals in the food. And then in disposal, we have burning, which releases toxic fumes, the accumulation of plastic in landfills, which are almost always located in poorer communities, and then the stuff that's shipped overseas ends up in the world's poorest countries, gives us environmental injustice on a global scale. Here are a few pictures of the injustice that is associated with plastic. Here's another picture of East Palestine, Ohio, and the other two pictures are pictures from Nigeria that were taken by Dr. Adatun Mustafa, who was one of the members of our commission, showing how in a poor African country like Nigeria, this plastic waste just piles up. And here's a community down in Louisiana, in so-called Cancer Alley in southern Louisiana, where you have these little shotgun houses right in the shadow of this huge plastic production facility. So what were the main findings? Let me summarize what I've been rattling through here. 6 billion tons of plastic waste produced the planet. That's 3/4 of the 8 billion that have been produced since 1950. Plastic production is increasing exponentially. It's on track to double by 2040 and triple by 2060 if we don't somehow bend the curve. We know that plastic causes disease, disability, and death at every stage of its life cycle, and it drives climate change. It's much more than beach litter. It's much more than stranded whales. As bad as those things are, it causes disease across the whole life cycle. Those diseases are very expensive, more than 1.2 trillion per year. And these harms fall disproportionately upon the world's poor, upon poor people in rich countries, and on poor countries on a global scale. So the time has come when we need to heed these findings and we need to act. And of course, there's much we still don't know about plastic. So many of those chemicals, for example, that we've never tested. It's going to be a long time before we know everything there is to know about plastic, maybe centuries. But we know very clearly that there are harms. We know that those harms are serious. We know that if we do not act, the harms will get worse. And we cannot use the lack of complete information as an excuse to sit on our hands and take no action. We just can't. The plastic industry would like to say, well, we don't know everything there is to know about plastic. Let's wait till we have more information, maybe in 2060 or so, and then we'll have enough information to take action. That makes no sense, because the waste is piling up, the hazards are piling up, and the harms are accumulating. The United Nations has taken note of the global plastics crisis, and 2 years ago, in March 2022, the 193 nations who comprise the UN Environment Assembly agreed to develop a global plastics treaty. And the work on the treaty has been proceeding. Since that time, the most recent meeting of the treaty negotiators took place just 2 weeks ago in Ottawa, Canada. Our Minero-Monaco Commission had several key recommendations for the treaty negotiators. Firstly, we said that the treaty has to do more than just protect the environment. It must protect human health, and especially the health of vulnerable people. That has to be an overarching goal. And secondly, we said that the core component, the very heart of the Global Plastics Treaty, needs to be a global cap on plastic production. The world cannot simply afford to double plastic production in the next 20 years and triple it in the next 40 years. The world will be awash in plastic if that happens. And the great power of a cap, it's like turning off the tap. In fact, if you go back and you look at that picture I showed you, that's an image of the plastic tap. And what a global cap does is it ratchets that down. We don't need to turn it off entirely, of course. Some plastics are essential. I can tell you as a medical doctor that there are things that we simply could not do in medicine today without plastic. Think of intravenous, think of endoscopes, think of laryngeal tubes, things like that. Some plastics are necessary. But we need to cap the stuff. We especially need to ratchet back the production of single-use plastic, which is contributing disproportionately to the accumulation of waste. And then we made a series of specific recommendations. The first one, to restrict manufacture of single-use plastics, to include plastics chemicals in the treaty. Some people in the plastics industry would like the treaty not to speak only to the polymers and not to speak to the chemical additives. There needs to be extended producer responsibility, which means that instead of selling plastic and forgetting about it, manufacturers have to take it back at the end of each use. A common example that we're all familiar with is bottle return laws. You collect your plastic and your glass bottles, you bring them back, and you get 5 cents or 10 cents. And when thousands of people do that, it adds up, turns into real money. And it forces the plastic producers to say to themselves, maybe we shouldn't make stuff that just gets used once and brought back. Why don't we make reusable stuff made out of, say, glass, and reduce the pollution? The treaty needs to address the social impacts of plastic, and it needs to tighten restrictions on the export of plastic to developing countries. And finally, the treaty needs to be guided by a permanent scientific policy body who will make recommendations, because new science is going to come in over the years as the treaty is enforced, and there need to be scientists who are independent of the plastics industry who are guiding the treaty implementation. So the good news, as we wrap it up here, is that if we want to do it, we can fix the plastic crisis. And the reason I can say that, the reason I'm optimistic about that, is I look at other kinds of pollution, like air pollution. In this country, we have reduced air pollution by 78% since the passage of the Clean Air Act in 1970. That has saved tens of thousands of lives. It's been very cost effective, and it has shown us how to do it. We start with laws and policies, we set standards, we enforce those standards, we penalize the people that break the law, and we incentivize the people that do the right thing. That's the toolkit. The details will differ for air pollution to plastic to water pollution, but the toolkit remains the same. The impediments are not scientific, they're not technical, they're legal, they're economic and political. And I can tell you, when I was up in Ottawa last week at those negotiations, the plastic and the petrochemical industries were out in force, doing everything they could to obstruct the treaty process. And that's just not right, but that's what they do. And I believe that it is our generation's moral and ethical duty to be courageous, to face up to those impediments, and to act courageously to protect our children's health and to preserve our common home. So let me say in conclusion, thank you. And remember, it's not just plastic waste, it's plastic production. And if we don't do something about production, we'll never do anything very effective about plastic waste.
Thank you so much, Phil. That's a lot to take in, and it's great to have your perspective on it. I've been monitoring the questions in the Q&A, and of course, there are quite a lot. I do want to say that the growing research on the health impacts of plastic is one of the reasons why we at Beyond Plastics are so focused on ending plastic pollution. We have to reduce the production of unnecessary plastics, and we have to address the toxic exposures that come from the unregulated chemical additives in plastics. This group has a lot of questions from the macro to the micro. A couple of people were asking about the annual $1.2 trillion healthcare costs. Are those global or just for the US?
They divide into two buckets. Roughly half of them are global, and those are the costs of plastic production. And the other half are US only, and those are the costs associated with plastic chemicals. We're actually working on a follow-up project right now where we're getting data on chemical exposure in many more countries. And as we get information on plastic chemical exposure in more and more countries, we'll be able to revise that figure of $600 billion per year. It'll become a much larger number as data from more countries come in.
Thank you. Someone is wondering, are the decreased sperm counts and undescended testicles among the consequences of plastics in humans?
So one of the very widely used additives in plastic is a class of chemicals called phthalates. Phthalates are added to stiff plastics to make them flexible. Phthalates leach out of plastic, they get into the environment, they get into people. They're detectable in the bodies of practically every American. And a number of studies have now shown that prenatal exposure to phthalates can have negative effects on fetal development. And specifically, phthalates target the genital organs in baby boys and make the genital organs smaller and set the stage for reduced sperm counts, increased undescended testicle, and possibly increased risk for testicular cancer in the teen years and early 20s. By way of no harm, they also damage the developing brain and can reduce IQ.
Mm-hmm. And while we're on that topic, I want to mention this amazing book by Dr. Shauna Swan called Countdown: How Our Modern World is Threatening Sperm Counts, Altering Male and Female Reproductive Development, and Imperiling the Future of the Human Race. Dr. Swan is a very well-respected epidemiologist. This entire book is not all about plastic, but there is a chapter on plastic that is worth taking a close look at. For some reason, sperm count always comes up as a question.
I think another one that's coming up as a question, both from our audience and other audiences that I've seen on this topic, is about exposure. Number of people are asking about what, let's see, do we have any sense of how much a typical American adult is exposed? And are there places in the world where people have greater or lesser exposures?
impossible to say with any certainty how much plastic is getting into us every day. And we just have, people are struggling to come up with methods to measure microplastics in the human body. But those methods are not available in your doctor's office or your local hospital. They're only available in research labs. CDC and a few other big laboratories have gotten very good, however, at measuring some of the chemicals that leach out of plastic. They do a very good job of measuring phthalates and bisphenol A and brominated flame retardants and other chemicals that are put into plastics and that are widespread in the environment. And they find those classes of chemicals in more than 90% of Americans. And every one of those chemicals has negative effects on human health. But if you ask me how much disease do we really have a good handle today in the year 2024? How much disease is caused by plastics? No, we have estimates that I presented in that slide on the costs. We know that those estimates are lowball estimates. We always undercount the full reality. But my suspicion is that it's probably many tens of thousands of disease, strokes, heart attacks, diabetes, obesity, and cancers that are caused by plastics in adults, and thousands of premature births, low birth weight babies, asthma, and other congenital anomalies caused in infants by plastic. It's a big burden. It's like an iceberg. We know it's there. We sense its presence. We can see part of it, and a lot of it is still below the water.
There are so many questions that are actually particular to microplastics and nanoplastics. People are asking about the impact of micro and nanoplastics on the immune system, which I believe was covered a bit in the Minderu report.
Yeah, some of some of the chemicals in plastics are chemicals that can suppress the immune system. I would pick out in particular the PFAS chemicals, which we run into in nonstick pans and water repellent raincoats, and those, without mentioning any brand names, and those chemicals leach out of the frying pan. They leach off your raincoat. They get out of other products. A lot of them are in plastic, and they can get into the human body. And one of their impacts is to suppress the immune system. Specifically, what they've been shown to do is that they blunt the formation of antibodies when a person gets a vaccination. So somebody goes to get their COVID shot, or a child goes to get their measles shot, and if there are PFAS in the person's body, the level of antibodies will be lower than it ought to be.
There's also some concern reflected here about medical devices and medical plastics. What would the impact be, for instance, of having an insulin pump that's in the body and sitting there? Is that leaching toxins and microplastics? Is it something that someone should be worried about? And are there alternatives?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because right now a lot of medical devices are made out of plastic and there are no good alternatives. I think there should be an impetus there should be incentives for people to develop insulin pumps, cardiac implants, and other materials that are not for plastic. But I suspect that there are some types of plastics that we're just going to have to live with. There's a lot of plastic we can get rid of. Most single-use plastic, in my opinion, is stupid plastic. We can get rid of it. But I think if you've got diabetes and you need an insulin pump, I would say get the insulin pump because you need to control your diabetes. If you need a plastic heart valve because you're in aortic valve failure or mitral valve failure, and the surgeon wants to put in a plastic valve, accept it because it can save your life.
Should we be concerned about plastics in pharmaceuticals? Is it possible that plastics are being transferred from pharmaceutical vials into medications?
Well, many of the capsules that we eat, for example, the capsules on most pills are made out of plastics. They're made out of plastics that dissolve in your stomach. So it's right there. It's not just the bottles.
Mhm. It's a physiology question that a lot of people have. Why don't we just pass the plastic? How does it wind up in our organs?
It gets out of the gut and into the bloodstream and then into the organs because it breaks down in the environment, it breaks down in the human body, and it breaks down into particles that are small enough to escape from the gastrointestinal tract and get into the bloodstream. Some of those, and these are the micro and nanoplastic particles. Some of those micro and nanoplastic particles arise in the body. If you swallow a plastic pill, for example, and the pill is dissolved by your stomach acid, microplastics are going to be formed. But other microplastics come in from the outside. If you eat food that's been wrapped in plastic wrapping, there are probably going to be some microplastic particles, quite a few of them, in that food. If you eat seafood from polluted water, the seafood will have accumulated microplastic particles, and you'll eat them, and some fraction of them will pass through, but others will be absorbed into the bloodstream and then get into your heart, get into your brain, get into your liver, get into other organs.
People are wondering also about the New England Journal of Medicine study, and it's kind of a related. Are there lifestyle drivers or environmental drivers that might have led to the presence of microplastics in the arteries of that 50% of patients in the Italian study versus the 42% who didn't? Did the study address that at all?
The study did their best to balance the two groups of people in terms of age, gender, lifestyle, and so on. But it is, after all, only one study, and that's the way medicine works. One study like this gets published, it makes a finding. Other investigators in other parts of the world will find other populations of people and try to replicate the study, and they'll either prove or disprove the validity of these findings. I think it's going to be very hard to make these findings go away. They're too striking, but we'll probably find that certain lifestyle factors play a role. But what the sheer magnitude of that finding, the fact that people who had microplastics in their body were 450% more likely to have terrible events in a 3-year period, is pretty hard to wish away.
And I don't know if it was the study itself or your editorial accompanying the study recommended that doctors should tell their patients to try to avoid plastics.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, every one of us operates at multiple levels in society. We operate in our home, we operate in our community, we operate in the wider society. So in your home, if you're a responsible adult, you're the CEO in your home, you have control over what stuff you buy, what materials you bring into the house. And you can choose to bring in food wrapped in plastic, or you can get fresh food. You can choose to buy ultra-processed food, which is loaded with plastic, or not ultra-processed food, which has maybe not zero plastic, but much less plastic. You can eat organic. Organic food in general, it has much lower chemical content, much lower pesticide, much less plastic than anything that's so-called conventionally grown. But beware, USDA organic means it's really organic. If it's labeled natural or homegrown or something like that, has no meaning. So that's in the home. In your community, you can do things like work with the school board to get rid of plastic plates and plastic cups and plastic cutlery in the dining hall, and replace those with pressed paper plates and pressed paper cutlery. Those products are available. And if there's a slight marginal increase in cost, I think it's worth it, because it's going to save your children a lot of disease in the years ahead. You can get rid of plastic trash bags and go back to paper trash bags. You can ask the dry cleaner to just give you your shirts without a plastic wrapper, the plastic wrapper that you basically peel off as soon as you get home and throw it away anyway. There's all sorts of things you can do at the community level. And thirdly, we're all citizens. We're members of the wider society. And we can act. We can act in our local towns to pass plastic ordinances, like banning plastic bags, banning plastic straws. We can act at the state level. Judith is going to say some words at the end of this session about a law that's currently pending in New York State to reduce the use of unnecessary plastics. And at the national level, we can write to our members of Congress, we can write to our senators, and we can tell them that we really want the United States to be solidly behind a global plastics treaty that has teeth, that really sets targets and timetables and turns off the tap and reduces global plastic production. We cannot fall for the spiel that the plastic industry is putting out that we can somehow recycle our way out of plastic. It's not that people don't care. People do care. But the damn plastic does not lend itself to recycling. It simply can't be recycled. People have been trying for 30 years to recycle plastic, and the recycling rates are less than 10%, about 6 or 7% globally. So don't fall for the recycling argument. The only effective way to get out of the plastic crisis is to be a citizen who tells your national and your state and national representatives to work to reduce plastic locally, nationally, globally.
So Megan, maybe this is a good time for me to jump in on the policy close.
I was gonna say, what a segue. You guys coordinated.
As if we did. And great job capturing so many questions and the rapid fire responses. Thank you. So I appreciate this transition to what can we do as citizens of the world. Beyond Plastics is very active nationwide, but we are only truly involved at the domestic level, mostly local, state, and federal, and we have our hands full with the United States. We're not directly involved in the Plastics Treaty as much as I would like to be, but I do want to direct you to the websites of Center for International Environmental Law, SEAL, and also IPEN, one of our partners who we work with, IPEN.org. You'll get the latest information on the Plastics Treaty. And I'm very saddened to say that the United States government has not played a particularly constructive role or a leadership role in these treaty negotiations. The treaty was launched by the United Nations. Many of us are familiar with COP, the climate change negotiations. And Bill McKibben, a wonderful writer and climate change activist, once said, winning slowly is actually losing. And that's what we're facing here. There's supposed to be just one more big negotiation session in Korea at the end of the year. So you have time today, if you're interested in the treaty, to write to the US State Department, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, urge that the United States change its position and be more protective of health and the environment. Also, I know from my tenure in the federal government, agencies, even the big State Department, listen to members of Congress. So if it feels like writing to the Secretary of State is too big, well, first of all, it's not. And second, write to your two federal senators, your US senators, and your member or the House of Representatives. There's some good leadership from countries that are part of something called the High Ambition Coalition. And I'm afraid that the US is not officially part of, but are informally is with the Low Ambition Coalition, siding with China, India, Saudi Arabia, and other countries that are not really serious about reducing the production of plastics. So that's at the international level. At the state level, we really need your help on an important bill that is pending in the New York State Legislature. So if you are a resident of New York, you can help us. If you don't live in New York, you probably know someone who lives in New York. Everyone has a niece or a nephew who has moved to Brooklyn in the last few years, no matter where you're from. So we need your support on what is the most sweeping plastics reduction legislation in the country. It's called the New York Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act. Tons of information on the Beyond Plastics website. It's Assembly Bill 5322B, sponsored by Assemblywoman Deborah Glick, Senate Bill 4246B. If someone can put those bill numbers in the chat, by Senator Pete Harcum in the Senate. We're having a lobby day in Albany on May 14th, along with a rally. And if I could just take a moment to tell you the key provisions of this bill and why we're so excited about it. First, it requires that plastic packaging be reduced 50% over 12 years, recognizing that plastics recycling has been an abysmal failure. And it's not a long-term aspirational goal like reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in 30 years. One thing I learned in state and federal government is you need incremental goals that, as Phil said, that have teeth. So 10% reduction after 3 years, 20% reduction after 5 years, 30% reduction after 8 years, 40% reduction after 10 years, and 50% reduction after 12 years. So there is time for companies to adjust and to innovate. Second key provision of the bill is it gets the most toxic chemicals out of packaging. 19 specific chemicals would be prohibited from packaging. Chemicals like PFAS chemicals, vinyl chloride, formaldehyde, lead, mercury, cadmium. We do not want those chemicals in our packaging, particularly food and beverage packaging. Third key provision is the plastics and chemical industry is now pushing something called chemical recycling or advanced recycling as their new solution. Big problem is it doesn't work. And when it does have modest effectiveness, it's just mostly creating new fossil fuels through a process called pyrolysis. The last thing we need. Some facilities do produce new plastics, but use a massive amount of toxic chemicals. There's a report on our website from last October documenting this. And then finally, this bill puts a modest fee on packaging because right now, big companies have no skin in the game. They produce all of this packaging and then they wipe their hands of it after they sell it, and they take no financial responsibility for reducing or recycling or managing the waste. So new money for local government, which is why local governments across the state are supporting this. This is an election year in New York. Voters want to see strong policies to reduce pointless plastic. So we need you to contact your state senator, your assembly member, join us in Albany. The session is supposed to end around June 6th, so we don't have much time. Jump in the pool with us because the only thing we have on our side is facts and people power. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Judith. Well, I think we're right at time. It's 8:01 on the East Coast, and we do need to respect all of our participants and, of course, all of our viewers for their time. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Especially thank you to Dr. Landrigan, whom I hope we see again soon. And please stay with us at Beyond Plastics and stay with us in New York State as we push for this really momentous bill. Thanks very much, everyone.